Hi everyone. So I'll pose a few questions. This is after I had a meeting with one of our local politicians, and it left me wondering a few things. Anyways, I've been following this fellow Rocco Galati, and he's suing the Prime Minister and the Premier of Ontario and the health officers and a number of other people. And it's regarding the infringement of the rights under the Charters of Rights and Freedoms under the Canada Constitution and what it's doing to people and businesses and that kind of thing. So here's some of the things that I've been asking. So we'll start with a big question, because Rocco Galati said that there's no evidence that this coronavirus actually exists. So there's a thing called Koch's postulates, and what it says is that in order to isolate a virus or offending bacteria, whatever, that is causing the disease, you collect a sample from somebody who's sick. And then when you take the sample, you actually grow it. And if it's a virus, you actually have to grow it in animal tissue in order for it to grow. Because it doesn't multiply by itself. It needs tissues to grow in, and it takes over the tissues and gets them to multiply it for them. So the idea is you collect the infected specimen, you set it up to grow it in a particular way, and then when you get enough, you subject a transgenic animal. That's an animal that's been bred to respond like we do. There's mice that have certain traits that respond like breast cancer people or ladies and that kind of thing. So they do have these specific animals. And unfortunately, when I'm looking around, because this information on the SARS-CoV-2 or Covid19 or whatever came from China, China suggested this is the virus that is causing all the trouble, and they did some studies to prove it. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find those studies, so I looked around and I keep looking, and what I found was that there's this, and again, this is fairly recent, June 24th, and it says that early diagnosis by this test called a PCR test. Now, a PCR test basically is not definitive for a specific virus. It does not pick out a specific virus, especially the coronavirus, because there's many different forms of coronaviruses, and they're very, very similar, and that might be why the tiger at the zoo in New York got tested positive with the PCR test for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So PCR is not a diagnostic test. Now, it can tell you if you have a big viral load, but whether the viruses are infective or not is another story. And that's because a lot of viruses, for example, if you go to Google and look under the human virome, you realize that there's 380 trillion viri in each human being, on average, 380 trillion. So we're testing for one that we're expecting to be there, and the test, again, is not designed to pick out a specific virus, but it picks out the RNA of the virus, and because there's so many of these coronaviruses, which is the SARS-CoV-2 is one of them, it's very difficult for you to actually say, oh yeah, that's it. And that's why there's so many false positives. And as a matter of fact, even the Ontario health officer said that when they test a particular group, a group that's not infected, but how do you know they're not infected if you don't have a reliable test to say if they are, says that the error is 50%.
Hello, thank you for taking my call.
Yeah.
Premier, I'm wondering why mandatory testing isn't required regularly of teachers to catch anything before it might erupt.
I'm sorry, Dr. Yaffe, but you're going to have to come back up here.
You know, I think a lot of people think that testing is going to really solve the whole problem, and it isn't. And in fact, if you're testing in a population that doesn't have very much COVID, you'll get false positives almost half the time. That is, the person actually doesn't have COVID, they have something else, they may have nothing. So it will just complicate the picture.
And the Chinese have said it's up to 80%, but we'll take 50%. But 50% is not a test. Can you imagine if somebody was testing food products and they were only 50% right when there was something deadly in the food product? That's the error rate of this. So we're shutting down everything with an error rate of 50%. That's really, really concerning for me. So let's look again. So here we go. This is a publication called STAT, and this is from March 5th. And they're trying to find an animal that actually responds to this SARS-CoV-2 virus. They didn't find it in March. So then I looked again recently, a couple of weeks ago, and this is June 2020. Interesting. So what do they say? There's an urgent need. Interesting. This is June. There's an urgent need for an ideal animal model that can reflect clinical symptoms and underlying etiologies, where it comes from, or etiopathogenesis, similar to COVID-19 patients, should be pretty well the same, which can be further used for evaluation of underlying mechanisms, potential vaccines, and therapeutic strategies. So they still haven't found an animal that can actually exhibit these symptoms. Not only that, the symptoms are all over the place. But anyways, so I say that, if you haven't got an animal that can demonstrate it, then you haven't demonstrated that the virus is there. And the 50% test isn't very good either. So you got to question politicians. I'm sorry, they're nice people. I'm not saying they're not nice people. But everything I've read, as a matter of fact, I'll go to the one person that I rely on most, and that's Noam Chomsky. When he was asked about Trump and the Russians, he said, don't worry about the Russians. The Russians have little to do with what goes on and little effect on the political system. Is not the Russians. It's the big corporations that buy the politicians and get them to do their bidding. And there was that Princeton study that showed that if a corporation was going to benefit from a new legislation, then they were way more likely to get it through than the average person if it was good for the general public. So I'm sorry that I don't trust politicians to make decisions for me. Every time I go to visit them, there's something they don't know, and they're making a decision on information they don't have, or they don't have adequate information. So I don't trust them. But hey, I'm just questioning. This is just a big question. Do you trust politicians, and do you trust that there is something else going on here? You know, like, did they find the SARS-CoV-2 virus or not? So, again, I'm asking you to make your decision based on, and go and do your own research. Don't just look at my stuff. This is just what I found, and I've been looking for a long time. And I have a little background in the healthcare field, but I'm not a virologist. And I'm not an epidemiologist, but I do understand those to a certain degree. I did take microbiology when I was in chiropractic college, and did learn a bit about it and understand it, and looked into the PCR test and that kind of thing. And I understand a little bit about genetics too. So the thing that came up for me is that the politicians are screaming that there's a lot more cases right now, a lot more cases. So I decided to go to our provincial CDC website, so the BC CDC website, and have a look at what's going on. So here's what I found. So I looked at the new tests. So here you can see at the bottom, it says new tests, and all the way up until September. Into September where we are right now. So I looked at these tests and I said, okay, they're doing, wow, a lot more tests. Is that good or is that bad? Well, the test isn't accurate, as we know. It doesn't identify a specific virus. It could identify viral load. Whether that's infective, whether that's a serious concern or not, I don't know. And you can't tell from this test. And symptoms aren't that good either. So then I went to, okay, what about cases? Whoa, looks almost like the same graph. The more testing they did, the more cases. Let me go back. The more testing, the more cases, the more cases. Isn't that interesting? So a test you can't rely on, but the more testing you do, the more cases you get. That's quite interesting. I'm kind of wondering, to me this just doesn't seem right. Using a test that can't be relied on to specifically test for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but then again, you're saying that there's a lot of these positive tests because we've got a lot more cases. So, back to more tests, back to more cases. So that doesn't add up to me. I have a questioning mind, so I'm not quite sure on that one. So what do we know about the facts? Well, first of all, the models that were put out were wrong by a huge margin. In other words, they were saying that millions of people were going to die. Millions of people didn't die. And then they said that the hospitals were going to be overwhelmed. And they never were. As a matter of fact, the most people they said that died already had a pre-existing condition and that they were a lot older. And we know from last year, we didn't have as many flu victims, and so the influenza didn't get as many people last year, so they were left around, and they were a little even more weak this year. So something did affect them for sure. And now we talk about the second wave. Well, let's go back to what is the second wave? Well, again, here's the tests, new tests. Oh, a lot more tests. Oh, a lot more cases. Is that the second wave? Leave it up to you to think about that. Okay, so there's thousands of medical doctors out there that are coming out and saying that they don't think that this is the problem. I think there's something else going wrong. I think we've gone too far over the edge, and of course politicians are definitely not going to admit that they're wrong, especially when they're this deep into it. They're trying to cover up their tracks, I would say. That's my opinion. Again, it's my opinion. You decide. I'm leaving it up to you. And why is Facebook and YouTube taking down all of these reputable scientists who don't go along with the World Health Organization and don't go along with their this decision on what's going on out there? And some of those things are changing. Like the CDC, they've downplayed the number of actual deaths from SARS-CoV-2. They've actually said that it's a very small fraction of what they said because there were so many people with other underlying conditions that were dying anyways. So, and other people that were questionable, they tested them with a questionable test and said they died from SARS-CoV-2 or Covid19 when they might have died with the positive test but not showing any symptoms. And again, I go back to the CDC and I looked at this, and I could go in depth. I could spend a whole hour on that one. But the symptoms are the same as influenza and allergies. So if they are, and the test isn't that reliable, it leaves a lot of questions to be asked that politicians really don't want to answer. So, what do you think is going on? Do you trust your politicians to be really working in your best interest? Or do you think it's a big scam? Some people do. Now, the big problem is that it's hard for people to change their belief systems, especially when you think that government might be lying to you. Well, the question is, when are they not lying to you? Anyways, I'll leave that up to you. And I like this statement by Virginia Satir. Virginia Satir was one of the most effective family counselors there ever was. She'd get the whole family in and find out what was going wrong with them. But the thing she found out was that people in the family are so stuck on their beliefs that they will not move from what is familiar with them to the unfamiliar to make a decision. So you have to ask yourself, are you really willing to look at these numbers, to really look at what's going on, to make a real informed decision? And again, go back, look at the sources for my information. Find your own information. See what you think. But just take a really close look. Thanks for tuning in.